Hey everyone, I'm Mark, and today we're going to break down how to do a general aviation flight with BeyondATC to bring a bit more immersion to your flying. This isn't a full setup guide for BeyondATC since there are plenty of those already, as well as the official documentation to help you get set up, but I've gotten a few requests asking about how to get used to doing a flight with it, how to get familiar with talking on the radios, and how to not get overwhelmed with the extra workload, so that's what we're going to focus on here. We're going to be focusing on all of the comms we need to do on the ground today, which is going to involve 3 separate communications with ATC, and then we'll look at how to handle the in-flight portion in the next video. The first step before we can get into all of that though is to create a SimBrief flight plan to feed it into BeyondATC. Our route's going to take us from Victoria, so CYYJ, out to Kelowna, which is CYLW. And for the airplane type, we're going to use the TBM 930 since it's got the range and the speed to make this flight go by in a jiffy. Now, the next thing that we need to sort out is what we want BeyondATC to call us by as we're flying around. And typically for a GA flight, you'd use your tail number. So you'll want to set that in the registration field that's right here. I use the same tail number from flight to flight regardless of the plane I'm using, just so that it's easier to remember and to realize when they're actually calling you on the radio. And so that it works correctly, also make sure that you've got nothing in the airline, flight number, or the call sign fields, because otherwise it can get confused with it. Another option, instead of using your tail number, you can also use a charter or business jet call sign, since BeyondATC recognizes most charter companies around the world as well. And to make that work, you'd use the airline and flight number fields instead. There's actually a list of all the company ICAO codes that BeyondATC recognizes in their official documentation, which links out to the FAA's website, and it has pretty much every operator around the world, so you should be able to find something that's fun and works for you, and the link for that will be in the description. For today though, I'm going to go back to using the plane's registration, but I often alternate between the two options. It really just depends on what type of flight I'm trying to reproduce. Next, I'm going to tweak the route down at the bottom here just a tiny bit so that it covers a few more scenarios, but generally speaking, the route that it proposes for most flights is going to be fine. Other than that, we're going to leave everything else as is. We'll hit generate and we'll swap into Flight Sim. Once you've loaded into your departure airport, the next thing is to launch BeyondATC, and once it's finished loading, the order that I like to do things in is to first get my clearance and then do the rest of my pre-flight. The flow with every IFR flight starts the same. First, we're going to get our ATC report, which will have the latest weather, and then from there, we'll get our clearance, which will confirm all of our departure details from our SimBrief plan. All we need for that is to turn on the batteries and the avionics, and if the plane you're flying has a ground power unit that you can connect to it, it's not a bad idea to use it to avoid draining your batteries too much. So like I was saying, before we can call for our clearance, we need to get the latest weather from the ATC for our departure airport. To do that, we're going to start by clicking on the headphones icon, and then if we click on our origin at the top here, it'll show us all of the frequencies at this local airport. The comms radios are very similar to the nav radios in the sense that you have 2 separate comms channels, COM1 and COM2, and each one supports an active frequency and a standby frequency that you can swap to quickly. We'll only be using COM1 in this video to keep things simple, but you can use both of them at the same time, and we could look at that in a future video if you're interested. All of the frequencies that you see in BeyondATC are in the order that you'll need them during a flight. And what we're looking for is right at the top, which is the ATC frequency on 118.8, so we can tune that into the radios.
Victoria Airport Information Sierra, 0028 Zulu, wind 105 at 7, visibility tree 0, few clouds at 24,000, temperature 26, dew point 1 tree, altimeter 2990. Landing and departing runway 0914. Transition level 180. Bird activity in vicinity of airport. Advise on initial contact you have information Sierra.
That last little bit where it said information Sierra, that's what we're going to repeat back to the clearance frequency so that they know we have the latest airport information. And we're pretty much at the point where we can go get that now. So let's switch to the clearance frequency. The goal of this step is to request and then receive authorization from ATC for the flight plan that you filed, and while it often is exactly what you put in SimBrief, there can be small differences, especially if there's a wind or runway change. If you're starting at a really small airport, there may not be a clearance frequency, so what you can do in that case is contact the center frequency instead, and they'll be able to handle the request for you. One of the best shortcuts that they've made is that you can just click the frequency that you want to tune and it'll switch it automatically for you into the active frequency, which is especially useful when you're flying and things get busy, since you can always quickly change to a new frequency. Before I give clearance a call though, I always make sure to have my SimBrief plan visible, as well as somewhere to jot down the additional information that they're going to give us. Anytime that you're contacting a new frequency for the first time, the structure of the message is always going to be the same. You start by saying who you're contacting, then you say who you are, and lastly you say what your request is or whatever your current status is. Victoria clearance, Charlie Mike 5 Kilo Lima, requesting IFR clearance to Kelowna with Sierra.
Charlie Mike 5 Kilo Lima, Victoria delivery, information Sierra correct, expect runway 09er. Climb 6,000 feet on runway centerline, then expect radar vectors Watcom. Squawk for tree.
Alright, so there was a lot of information there to unpack, but the first part of the clearance tells us what runway to expect for takeoff, what we'll do after takeoff, and sometimes it'll also include an initial altitude to expect or even a heading to fly until they clear us to our first fix. So in this case, we're taking off on runway 9 and we're going to get vectors to Watcom, which is the first waypoint in our route. And it basically means that at some point after takeoff, they're going to give us a heading to fly that'll take us to that waypoint. One difference with what we filed is that they didn't mention the departure procedure, but if we look at the chart for it, it just says to fly the runway heading. So it's basically the same thing that they told us in the clearance. But if there was a bigger difference, then in that case, we would do what the clearance says rather than what we filed in SimBrief. We also got cleared to 6,000 feet, which means that we can keep climbing until we get to that altitude. And at that point, we'd have to level off unless they clear us to go higher before we get to 6,000. The last part of the clearance is our squawk code, which we have to set in our transponder so that they can track us. And we'll look at that in just a second. But first we need to repeat our clearance back to them so that they know we got it all correctly. If you're unsure what to tell them, it actually gives you a pretty good hint right here in the response window. And the easiest thing to do until you're used to the phrasing is to have your first officer respond for you by clicking on the option that's right here.
Expect runway 09er. Climb 6,000 feet on runway centerline, then expect radar vectors Watcom. Squawk 4333. Charlie Mike 5 Kilo Lima. Charlie Mike 5 Kilo Lima, read back correct. Contact ground 121.9er when ready for start or taxi.
We'll contact ground on 121.9 when we're ready for start for Charlie Mike 5 Kilo Lima. Every communication that you have with ATC always needs to be repeated back to them to avoid any mistakes or misunderstandings as to what was actually said and understood. One thing that I found hard to get used to doing is repeating back the frequency that they hand you off to, and I still sometimes forget to do it. So what I do in that case is let the first officer reply for me, especially if it didn't understand what I said. I don't bother trying to repeat it again. Now that we've got our clearance though, there's a few things you want to make sure to set up before you make your next radio call, and the first of those is to enter all of the route information that they gave you. I won't go over the details of how to do that part since it's going to be airplane specific, but you'll want to make sure that the route you enter matches what you were cleared for, so the same runway, waypoints, and altitudes. If they gave you an initial climb altitude, definitely set that on your autopilot right away as well, so that like that it'll give you a warning when you're 1,000 feet out if you're still hand flying, or if you've already enabled the autopilot, it'll automatically level off for you at that altitude until they clear you for your next climb altitude. The other thing that you'll want to make sure is set properly is your transponder code so that they can track your plane's location properly as you're flying around. And that was 4333 in our clearance. And I often forget to do this step, and it's a real pain too because you'll only realize it once you're in the air. You'll also want to set your transponder into altitude reporting mode, which is different depending on what type of transponder you have in the plane. So I'm showing you a few different ones right now so that you get the idea. As for the radios, I like to set up my next frequency that I'm going to need before I need it in the standby so that it's always available at a click of a button. And this actually applies throughout the flight. So our next frequency that we're going to need here is ground for push and start. So I'm going to start by setting that as the primary. This airport only has one ground frequency for the 2 active runways, but at some airports it's possible to have multiple ground, tower, and departure frequencies, and you can usually tell which frequency you're going to need next by looking right under it, because it'll say what runway that it applies to. Then in the standby, we're going to put the tower frequency, so that once we're in position, we just have to press swap and it'll be ready to go for us. And at that point, we'll also have to do the same thing again, set up the departure frequency so that once we need it, it is also ready for us to go. Then from there, it's just a matter of finishing up all of your pre-flight like normal, so wrapping up the last details of your flight plan, making sure your weight and balance is set properly, and so on. The last thing to keep in mind is that when you're just getting started, it helps to use a plane that you're already very familiar with its operations, because at least like that, you won't be struggling to figure out how to do all of this stuff in the plane on top of handling the radios. Once you're ready to get going, your next radio call is for engine start or pushback, whichever option you need or prefer, but either way, you're going to be responsible for doing the pushback. It won't do it for you. So for that radio call, we'll need to be on the ground frequency, which will handle that, plus giving us our taxi directions afterwards. And just like before, the call is going to be in the same format. So who we're calling, who we are, and what we want. And ground, Charlie, Mike 5 Kilo Lima, we're at the rest ramp, requesting engine start.
Charlie Mike 5 Kilo Lima, startup approved. Call when ready for taxi.
Startup approved, and we'll call when we're ready for taxi for Charlie Mike 5 Kilo Lima. With that done, we can start our engines just like normal, and if we had requested pushback, we could do that now too and run through our after start or before taxi checklist. Before you actually call for taxi though, if you have any type of charts available for the airport, it's a good idea to have them handy, especially for larger airports. From where we are right here, we won't have a very complicated taxi route, but if we did, you can either annotate the route directly in the tool if it supports it, or just having the map in front of you, honestly, to visualize as they're telling it to you is going to help a fair bit as well. If you do end up getting a complicated taxi route though, the easiest thing to do is to close the frequency window, and that'll show you the entire message history, including all of your taxi directions that you're going to need to repeat back to them. Ground, Charlie Mike 5 Kilo Lima, request taxi to runway 09.
Charlie Mike 5 Kilo Lima, runway 09er taxi via Echo.
Clear to taxi, runway 09, taxi via Echo for Charlie Mike 5 Kilo Lima. Now that we've got our taxi route sorted, we can get moving, and at some point during the taxi, you're going to be handed off to the tower, and it sort of varies where and when it does this depending on the airport.
Charlie Mike 5 Kilo Lima, contact Victoria Tower 119.7.
Over the tower on 119.7 for Charlie Mike 5 Kilo Lima. I got an early switch over here to the tower, and although I might swap the frequency over, I'll wait until I'm at the hold short line for the runway before contacting the tower, because otherwise it's going to clear you for takeoff while you're still taxiing around. The hold short line is the solid line that's followed by the dashed line that we see coming up right here just before we head out onto the runway. And anytime that you run into a solid line like this, you typically come to a full stop and get cleared to cross it by ATC. Holding short of the runway is actually where we're going to leave our video today, and we're going to look at the en route part of the flight in the next one. So if you learned some useful tips and hints on how to handle BeyondATC and ATC in general in Flight Sim, make sure to like the video and subscribe on your way out.